So our special guest, let me make sure I pull up her bio here. Excuse me. She is a really amazing human. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Susan Lovelle. So Dr. Susan Lovelle is a medical doctor, was a former plastic surgeon, award-winning plastic surgeon. She's worked all over the world. And as a side note, she was a prima ballerina, a working prima ballerina, traveling and touring with a dance company while she was going through her schooling to become a doctor, which is pretty impressive. So now today she has put behind her the plastic surgery days. She's the founder of Balanced Performance, and she offers all-in-one lifestyle health solutions for busy executives and innovative companies that they lead. She specializes in boosting energy, optimizing weight, and balancing hormones to unlock their peak performance in every aspect of life. She covers popular topics that directly affect productivity, well-being, from work-life balance strategies to the significance of self-care. She emphasizes the impact of personalized nutrition, sleep, and hormones on productivity and energy levels, while also offering effective stress reduction techniques to cultivate a more balanced life. Her unique gift, and I'm so glad that she talked about this because you all had your unique gifts that you kicked off the webinar with. Her unique gift is to inspire audiences to prioritize their well-being and embrace a lifestyle that nourishes them holistically throughout each of the 1,440 minutes in their day. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Lovelle.
Thank you so much. And while I'm putting up my slides, I want you all to put into the chat. Hopefully everyone can see that, my slides now. Put into the chat, are you using the GLP-1 receptor agonist already? Yes. Yes or no? And if you are, what are your thoughts about them? Do you like them? Is it kind of like, nah? Is it like, nah? Or do you just want to get into it? And that's why you're here as well. So give me all of those answers. I just want to take a good look and see where we stand. Yes, I got a yes and no's, like them. Yes, no, but I'm curious to know more. No, no, some patients. Okay, so let's get on with it, right? My only thing that I need to disclose is that this presentation is sponsored by Microbiome Labs. Great, okay. So what we're going to be covering today, we have a lot to cover. And as we were saying, if you have just answers, put them in the chat. Questions, put them in the question Q&A, and we'll get to all of them if we can. If we can't, we'll send you those afterwards. But today, we want to look at, number one, starting with a review. Let's look at what's been happening with obesity globally, really kind of focusing on the US, but really even globally over the last 20, 30 years, and how that's been impacting metabolic disease as well. We want to look at, okay, then now we've got this increase in obesity and metabolic disease. How is that impacting the pharmacology? Because it definitely is, right? We're going to be then looking at the interplay between these hormones, between our gut microbiome, between the GLP-1s, the GIPs, and stress, because I know I'm preaching to the choir, but we know what stress does to our bodies, right? And then finally, because all theory and no practical insights it's great, but what are you going to do on Monday morning or maybe tomorrow, right? So we want to know what are some of the practical things that we can start bringing into our practices if we're not already, and adding them so that our patients and clients get the best response that they actually need. So let's get started. Looking over the last 3 decades, okay, so way back 1995, you're seeing that 1995, the lowest and highest rates of obesity, and they used BMI for that. And I know BMI is not the greatest measure of obesity, right? Because we know, a really well-muscled athlete can be flirting with that obesity number because of height and weight, but they're all muscle. So not the greatest, but it does give us some ideas of those trends, right? So in 95, the lowest rates were around 10%, highest rate around 20. Decades later, 3 decades later, look where we are, right? If you look at that map on the right, we see in 2022, that's the last time that the CDC put out a map like this, that blue is that rate that's going up to 40%. So 13 states in the United States had rates that were about 40% obesity, right? But I like pictures and colors. So let's look at it this way as well. So in 1991, Some had no data, but there were quite a few states that had less than 10%, right? And there was no state had more than 20%. No state had more than 20%. Take it just a little bit later, about 10 years, almost 10 years later, look where we are, okay? And then finally, this is us 2013. So we're not even putting those numbers that I just told you for 2022. In 2013, look at that. How many states were already over that 35%? We're pretty much all. And Colorado was actually the last holdout, for less than 10%. And even Colorado has succumbed to these rates. So, it's all good to know the numbers. It's all good to know that, but what are the consequences? How were they impacting both the individual and society as a whole? Because they do. All right, so metabolically, just by definition alone, we know that if we have metabolic disarray, we're going to see higher cardiovascular risk, higher myocardial infarctions, higher stroke rates, higher rates of type 2 diabetes, certain cancers like colon, liver, breast, ovarian, arthritis. We're going to see these numbers as they increase. There was a scary statistic, another one, that about 40% of Americans now can be considered to have metabolic syndrome. 40% of Americans can be considered to have metabolic syndrome. And if you remember, it's those 5 numbers. It is high blood pressure, blood glucose over 100, fasting blood glucose over 100, elevated triglycerides, elevated waist circumference, and the last one, it'll come to me. There are 5. Cholesterol, HDL, low HDL, okay? So 40% of Americans have at least 3 out of those 5. That's what having metabolic syndrome is in America today. But then it's also the increased healthcare costs. And one of the reasons I love that, that Angelica went through my history, because I'm going to be sharing a couple of things throughout. As a plastic surgeon, we did a lot of elective surgery. So it meant that if a patient came in and they weren't metabolically healthy, so if they had diabetes that wasn't controlled, if they were markedly obese, if they had something going on where they were not healthy, we could just say, we can't do it. We're not going to do it, right? Until these things are corrected. And a lot of times, not the threat, but the promise of plastic surgery made them willing to make those changes so that they could then have their surgery. But what about all of the surgeons and the other physicians who don't have that choice? They're doing emergent and urgent surgeries like fractures and bowel obstructions. They can't say, no, I can't operate on you because you're not metabolically healthy. And so what we're seeing are these increased hospital stays, the complications after these surgeries, because we knew that they would happen in an elective surgery, but they also happen in the urgent and in the emergencies as well. We're also seeing increases in medications. And I'm going to get on my high horse a little bit, because one of the things that we see a lot is that our patients come to us with that, have an ill, take a pill. And you would put that in the chat right now. How many of you have a patient like I have? You'll come in and you'll ask them, maybe on your intake form, you're speaking to them, you ask them, well, do you have diabetes or do you have high blood pressure? And they say, nope, I don't have it. And then you go through their medications, and they're on 3 blood pressure medications, and they're on so many more for their blood sugar. Right, pill for every ill. Yes, a pill. Have an ill, take a pill, okay? Drives me nuts, because we've gotten that mentality, we've taught that mentality to our patients and clients, and we need to get them away from that, okay? So those medications. But then we have the indirect costs, the ones that we're not, very clear, okay, this is the issue, here's the complication, here's how much it costs. What about all the lost days of productivity, the absenteeism where they can't come to work because they're too sick, or even the presenteeism where they're at work, but they can't work because they hurt too much or they've got too much going on. They just can't do it, right? And so they essentially check out. Premature mortality and those higher insurance rates as well, okay? And then the exacerbating health disparities. And again, I'm going to get on a little bit of a horse here. We are in a country where there are disparities between healthcare that are given to different demographics. That's just a fact. But when we add metabolic disorders on top of that, those disparities get even wider. So these are the reasons that we need to take care of them. And then what is the impact of quality on their life? You know, physically and emotionally. They may say there is no impact because a lot of times we start fooling even ourselves. But let me tell you something. My daughter is a fire medic, right? And part of their training to be able to get into fires and get where they need to go is they strap on 50-pound weighted vests and then they run up flights of stairs. Okay, that's their training. They're running up and down flights of stairs. So I'm looking at her doing it. She's doing it no problem. She's getting around. And I said, okay, you know, let me put it on. So I said, let me put it on. I did. Well, she had to put it on me because I could barely lift it, right? And then I walked around. Within minutes, I was short of breath and winded. When I tried to walk up the stairs, one flight of stairs, not running up and down, one flight of stairs, it was so hard. So these are the changes. Now, our patients are not seeing 50 pounds. Usually, they're not seeing 50 pounds immediately. So what's happening? They're actually starting to acclimate to this weight. And they think that everything's okay. But we know that it's not. Metabolically, they're changing. And actually, in preparation for this, even after these slides were done, I read an article that was saying that the thought of metabolically healthy obesity is almost a myth. And what they looked at as we get older and that our BMIs get up higher, the rates are as low as 1% of people who are still completely metabolically healthy. So we need to make some changes for them, right? Right. The body heals the cut. I love that. Not the Band-Aid. Exactly. So what are the drivers that are so involved with this already? And that you can ask a million different people and get a million different answers, but I have a couple that we're going to go through today. One of them is this, right? As life has gotten easier, as it has gotten more automated, we've gotten less and less active, you know, and so now we know sitting is the new smoking. This picture always makes me laugh, but you know, obviously somebody was doing it, right? So getting up in our sedentary our sedentary lives is really something. The second one is what we're putting in our bodies, right? The SAD diet, the standard American diet, and all of the processed foods that we're putting in. But you know, even if you have learned that you're not going to be eating all of the junk, and I'm sure if you're on here today, you're already on that bandwagon. But what happens with all of the toxins that are out there that we can't avoid, even if we're trying to eat organically all throughout, there are some toxins that we just cannot avoid whatsoever. And so all of these things together with one more that we're going to talk about in just a bit, all of these things together lead to our issues with metabolic disorders. So we talked about the trend. We saw what it's doing. We know where it's going. How has that impacted the medical pharmacology and everything else? You know, gyms are up. Weight loss plans are up. Dieting is definitely up. Diet foods. If you go down any grocery store, what do you see? Aisles and aisles and aisles of all the diet food, the frozen diet food, right? So there are so many things that we're using so that, you know, last year, the industry in 2023 was almost $160 billion. $160 billion. If you extrapolate out just a mere 6 years, it's almost double that. So we're spending a fortune. But remember those pictures? Our obesity rates, our metabolic dysfunction rates are increasing just as fast. So what do we do about that? What do we do as clinicians? Before we get into that, though, I want to talk about the evolution of these weight loss medications over the years, over the decades. And what I did for each one of them, I gave you a little graphic for what we have found to be the highest side effect that was related to them. So way back in the 50s, we had the amphetamines. Okay, what was the issue there? Okay, they are addictive. Boom. All right. But then we get into the fen-phen, the fenfluramine, phentermine in the 70s. And here's where my history as a dancer comes in. So you may or may not know that dancers, ballet dance, I was a ballet dancer, traveled around the world. Ballet dancers often do things that are not quite the healthiest so that they stay at a certain weight. And I was no different. I'm going to be totally honest. So at one point, I got a referral to a physician, to a doctor who would give you a little packet of diet pills. This is back in the 70s, all right? I didn't know any better. They gave you little diet pills, and I would take them, not even knowing, I didn't even know what they were. All I knew was I wanted to lose weight, and this is the way I was going to do it. And it worked. One of them, looking back, I know was a diuretic because you know what they do. The other one, like I'm saying, this was back in the 70s, might have been fen-phen. I don't even know because I don't know what it was. And if it was, I'm lucky to be here without any heart issues because that was the big thing with fen-phen. Then in the 90s, we had orlistat. So this is looking at fat metabolism. And this was mainly, issues with fatty stools and things. But then we came in the 2000s. And this medication, which is off the market, sibutramine, was injuring people's hearts. And so it had to come off the market. Mid-2000s are when the GLP-1 receptor agonists came out. That's how long they've been out, really. But they came out at that point for diabetics, for lowering blood sugar. Hadn't really gotten into the whole weight loss aspect of it. And those early ones, and we'll talk about later, they usually just lasted maybe, you had to inject them twice a day. So it really wasn't the most efficient way, the nicest way for someone if they were not diabetic, okay? And GI, just like today, GI effects are usually the biggest thing. Lorcaserin came out in the 2010s, and that had a cancer risk. Okay, so that's off the market. And now we're up to the dual GLP-1s and the GIP agonists, receptor agonists. And, I put a question mark here. We know about the GI things that are going on, but what don't we know yet? And so this is one of the reasons I want to remind us that our primary goal is to do no harm, right? And so we want to make sure that we're doing the best for our patients. I'm not saying don't use them. I have them in with my clients as well. We want to keep in mind, looking back at that history, what don't we know yet? What aren't we, sharing yet? So what are incretins? And these are those gut-derived hormones that are coming out when you take a bite of that juicy hamburger, right there, maybe it's a juicy bean burger, whatever your choice is, you're taking a bite of it, right? And what does your body do? The gut sends off these hormones, which then tell the pancreas to give off insulin. Right? So then the insulin comes out, our blood sugar goes down. That's its job. And it does it in a glucose dependent manner, which means that as our blood sugar comes down, so does so do the levels of those hormones, which is a good thing because if they didn't, we'd get hypoglycemic, wouldn't be a great thing. They only last 3 to 5 minutes though. They are rapidly degraded by DPP-4, okay? So what are they? The GLP-1, the glucagon-like peptide 1, the GIP, which is glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide. I prefer to say the gastric inhibitory peptide, a lot easier to say, and then OXM, right? And then we come to the GLP-1 and GIP receptor agonists as well, okay? And these are now used more so we're realizing not just diabetes, but also for the management of obesity. And they do have a longer half-life. So remember, the actual hormones last 3 to 5 minutes. That's not going to be very effective or efficient. These new agonists, when they first came out, they lasted like the exenatide. Those lasted, you had to do them twice a day, inject twice a day. But now, the ones we have out coming now, semaglutide, tirzepatide, these will last about a week. Okay, so we've gotten them to a point where the effects last longer. We're getting the same sorts of responses, and that's why they're a lot more effective and efficient. Okay, so let's look at the GLP-1s right now. They are made in the L cells of the colon. All right, that's where they're secreted. And when our patients come into us, right, what are they coming to us for? If they're not diabetic, right, what are they coming to us for? They're coming to us for these two issues here. The effect on the brain. So they get rid of that mouth hunger. You know, that's something that I hear all the time. I'm not really hungry. My tummy's not hungry, but my mouth, my brain wants something to eat. And so this actually decreases that, decreases the appetite, increases satiety. But then the other thing that we love, or that they love, is the fact that it actually really is breaking down fat. We've got that lipolysis. And the important thing is that it's decreasing visceral fat. Now, they may not be coming to us for that, but we all know that that decrease in visceral fat is probably even more important than its effect on the regular fat in the body. When we go around to the pancreas, okay, we know that's what it's doing. I already said it's increasing insulin, decreasing glucagon, all right? But then other things, it helps us to, it helps with diuresis. And then when we look at the gastric effects, you have decreased gastric emptying, decreased GI motility. Now, this is important because if you think about it, especially if someone's already, if they're diabetic and they're already struggling with gastroparesis or reflux or constipation, and you're giving them something that's going to slow down further their gastric emptying, going to slow down their motility, that may become a significant issue. So we need to keep that in the back of our minds when we're talking with patients and treating patients. And then the last thing, which is actually very interesting, is that its effect on the heart. So we're seeing increased cardiac efficiency, as well as decreased inflammation, which we know is always a good thing, and decreased blood pressure. So interesting aspect of the GLP-1s. Now, the second one is the GIP. This is made in the K cells of the small intestine, all right? So I'm not going to go through the entire thing again, but looking at the two differences. When we look over at the pancreas, it still increases that insulin secretion, but it also increases glucagon. And so when we talked about the GLP-1, we wonder, let me just take the tip back. When we look at that, the insulin is increased, glucagon is decreased. So why do we call it glucagon-like polypeptide? It has the exact opposite response. Well, we say that because they both come from a hormone, pro-glucagon. The one goes to the pancreas and becomes glucagon. The other one goes to the L cells and becomes the GLP-1. That's why, because they start out in structure that's similar. So the other thing, going back to the GIPs, is that it's a little more involved with our immune system. Okay, so increased beta cells there. And down at the heart, with the heart, increased endothelial integrity. The last thing that it does is that it helps with bone formation. So we can see some changes in our bone with the GIP. So this is a question I know a lot of people ask: who wins that weight war between semaglutide and tirzepatide? And anecdotally, we hear that tirzepatide has a lower rate of GI distress versus semaglutide. It's not as close. When we actually look at the studies, not as close as you would want it to be, right? Or you would think it was. However, it does have an increase in waist circumference and a higher level of weight reduction. So if you look at it, the blue is the GI distress, not that big a difference between the two. But when we look at the decrease in waist, the tirzepatide has the edge, and then in weight altogether, it also has that edge. So when looking at the two, tirzepatide wins just a little bit. But because of price differences, I will often recommend that they start with semaglutide. If they can tolerate semaglutide, fine. It might take a little bit longer to see the response they want, but that's fine. If not, or if they want something a little faster or a little more active, then I might switch them over to tirzepatide. Great. Okay. So now let's review the gut-brain axis. Okay. Now, again, I know I'm preaching to the choir again when I say that the gut is is the basis of all disease begins in the gut. But what if we flip that on its edge and say all health begins in the gut as well? And that's what we see with the gut-brain axis, okay? It's that bidirectional communication that goes between the central nervous system, with the emotions and cognition, and that of the enteric nervous system. And, I say that the average person probably knew about this connection long before we as scientists did. Because what are some of the sayings that we have? When you're nervous, what do you say? I got butterflies in my stomach. Or, if you have a little weird feeling about something, what do you say? I have a gut feeling about that. And we realize now that these are real issues, these are real connections. What we may not realize, though, is that connection is a lot more. We have more connections from the gut to the brain than the other way around, making it our second brain, right? So let's talk about that axis. We got the vagus nerve, that vagrant nerve that goes all the way, the longest central nervous system nerve that goes all the way from the base of our skull, all the way down and winds itself all the way down to the proximal colon, right? And it innervates all of these things in between. It's looking at our lungs, our heart, our liver, innervates quite a few things. We have the hormonal pathways like serotonin and the GLP-1s and the GIPs that we just talked about. Serotonin, again, 70% of serotonin, which is so important for gut health, for our immune system, for even to sleep at night, all of these things, for our mood. Serotonin, about 70% of those are made in the enterochromaffin cells of the gut. It's our immune system. Again, so much of our immune system is right there. So systemic inflammation, as well as those immune responses. And then finally, the bacteria, which outnumber our cells by trillions, make their own things, the short chain fatty acids, the vitamins like K and the B vitamins as well. So our gut brain axis is important. Our gut is important as well, right? So now we've talked about the gut. Now, what does our microbiome look like on stress? Right? And a lot of us, when we say stress, we think of this, those external factors, the problems, the taxes, the finances, all of those things. That's what we think about of stress. But if we think back a few slides ago, what was it also? It's also the fact that we're not getting up and moving anymore. As a matter of fact, I'm doing this presentation standing because most of the time, and I recommend that you stand up during this as well, right? It's a whole hour. But it's the entire thing. We're not moving enough. It's what we're eating. All of these are stresses on our body. So when we have a lot of these stresses, what happens? Sometimes within minutes to hours, we can alter the composition and function of our gut flora. Minutes. Okay, stress can do that. On your balance board, love it, Marianne, love it. Increased intestinal permeability, which then leads to increased LPS, inflammation, immunity goes down, and changes in all those good things we just talked about, right? But there's a feedback loop. And when we have that stress that just continues and continues, it increases the risk of anxiety and depression. Remember, serotonin is so important for our mood. If our serotonin is messed up, so is our mood. And increase that corticotropin releasing factor and the cortisol, increasing our risk of IBS and IBD. So we're going to get into the real details of anyone. Right? Yes, exactly. IBS, it's all connected. Now, I didn't tell you too much of my story about how I got into what I do now, which is lifestyle health. But as a plastic surgeon, I was a solo plastic surgeon in a small town, and you would think that I wouldn't be very busy. Essentially, though, because I saw my patients during the day, did my surgery. Since I was solo, there was no one to assist me, so that meant my surgeries were sometimes 3, 6, sometimes 8 hours long. Then I came home and I was mom because, if you're having and raising kids, you can't not be mom. And then in the middle of the night, I would get called because I was the only plastic surgeon for an hour in any other direction. And I get called for what we call kitty lax. You all call them that as well, when the child falls off the table, bangs their head, gets a cut on their face, and they want a plastic surgeon. So now we're talking, I'm working almost 24/7, nobody, to back up. And eventually I ended up in the intensive care unit 3 times in the space of a year. That's what happened. Long story short, one of the things that happened was I developed leaky gut. And I love this picture because it really explains everything. But let's start with what it looks like to have a healthy gut. When you've got that healthy gut, what does it look like? You've got this blue, this beautiful blue color is the mucosal barrier. Look how beautiful that is. It's a strong barrier. Our gut is that first line of defense against all of the invaders that come in, right? So we see some of the bad things, we've got some good things, but there are low levels of those pathogens. The barrier is keeping them out. All of these junctions here are strong, right? Strong, tight junctions. They're all making what they need to be making, like the goblet cells here are making, we're getting, short chain fatty acids. We're doing the things that we need to do. But then what happens, right? When we have those stressors that continue, and we'll show what that looks like, we start seeing a lower diversity. We start seeing more of those problematic gram negatives that are making LPS, lipopolysaccharide. And that LPS causes a lot of trouble, right? It starts breaking down that beautiful blue barrier that we saw. The junctions start getting weaker and they get into the laminar propria. So, and let's just go on to here. And what does that end up? We end up with a dysbiosis. So the ratios of the good to bad is off. We get low keystone strains. And what are some of those important keystone strains, especially with respect to the GLP-1 and GIP production? Akkermansia, right? And Akkermansia is called, one of them is called Akkermansia mucinophilia, mucin lovers. So their job is to eat up the mucin and then develop more. So it's there to protect our mucin layer. When we have low ones, it starts looking like this. Then we get low diversity, the low short chain fatty acids, the butyrates, the propionates, and the acetates. Those three are specifically the food for our colon cells, the colonocytes. So if those go low, then we're not feeding our colon well, and we start having even more issues, okay? The mucosa gets disrupted, and it gets down into the barrier, right? So let's take a really close look. Let's really kind of hone in on what this looks like. So the cascade gets through, these LPS gets through the cascade, gets into there. It gets into the laminar propria, that LPS, right? But then it goes to a transfer binding protein. I call it a little boat. Gets on a boat and then travels to the dendritic cells and the macrophages, right? When it does that, it actually starts off that immune cascade, like the NF-kappa Bs, right? As well as these other interleukins, the IL-6, the IL-1s, the TNF alphas. So these are the ones that increase all of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. Now they're not only revved up, but they're in the system and they're going to be traveling to different areas around the body, right? And that's that beating ground for all of those chronic illnesses we just know about. What does it look like from the brain aspect, though? So remember we said it's not just the gut that's the problem, it's that gut-brain axis that becomes a problem when we are completely stressed. So a stress here will then increase our cortisol levels because it's going here. The CRF increases to our adrenals. We get more cortisol, but then it actually has us make a leaky gut. So all of those pictures with the cells, the tight junctions loosening, we have more of a leaky gut, right? But some of those interleukins, IL-6 specifically, activate the HPA axis. Okay, so now it's going way back up to the brain, telling the brain, make more, right? Make more CRF, make more cortisol. But so that we got this nasty feedback loop that just is a hot mess. Okay, so now let's take that last little step. What is the connection between dysbiosis and the incretins? So when you have that dysbiosis, when you have all of that LPS that's going out, you see more of the pro-inflammatory responses. We just saw that, all of those in that old inflammation, but it doesn't have the same effect on our blood sugar. So you got the worst of the worst, and you don't get the good, right? All of the bad, none of the good. Okay. And then finally, let me ask everyone, how many hours of sleep do you all get each night? How many of you get at least, yeah, just throw it in there. No, ooh, Jamie, love that. 9, 7 to 8. I love this. 6 to 7, 6. 6, yes, yes, not enough. I hear that. Yeah, 8 to 10. Yeah. Well, again, I guess I'm just preaching to the choir. Okay. Excellent. So, the studies are saying 7 to 9 is where we want to kind of lean out. But 6, if it is, it is. But I speak to so many audiences where it's a badge of honor. Remember, I'm talking to executives. It's a badge of honor to get 4 or 5 hours of sleep every night because I'm the big guy. No, no, we know, right? Okay, Lauren, we got to get you some more, right? We got to get you some more sleep. So we know that that's not enough. And what we're seeing is that sleep deprivation is going to also alter your gut microbiome, right? Again, in just one night of sleep. So if for no other reason than all of the things we just talked about, we want to make sure that we're getting enough sleep. And then finally, we look at all of the issues. Restful sleep. Yes, 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 yes. Very important. If we have time, maybe we'll go into that when we get into Q&As, what that really means. And then finally, we're seeing that whole microbiome type 2 diabetes connection. And I'm not going to go through all of these studies, but what we're seeing is that the butyrate producers, the bacteria, those bacteria are actually increasing our ability to regulate our insulin. It's taking care of insulin resistance, making us more responsive to it, makes things better in that sense. That's it in a nutshell. We want our microbiome to be diverse. We want to have the the keystone bacteria there. We want them all to be working for us in our, going in our position. So the last thing that I really want to go through is what does it look like as far as diet? What are some of the things that we eat and going this way? So if we have diet and stress, if we have a good one, we'll make that tryptophan, right? We either get it through our diet or our microbiome. We have tryptophan. If everything's good, if we're not stressed, if we're eating well, if we're getting the sleep that we need, if everything's good, we're going to take it down the serotonin pathway, right? That good pathway where we're going to have a good mood. We're going to make the melatonin that we need and that we want. And so we're going to be able to sleep. We're going to get that rest. We're going to have a better memory. We're going to have a better mood. But what happens when we add that stress? And we're going to be talking about 1714 and what it does in just a minute. But when we don't have that, that tryptophan instead goes down a different pathway, down the kynurenine pathway, making quinolinic acid. And this is where we get that irritability, the poor sleep, decreased concentration. So we want to be able to take care of that, right? And we know that, you may not know, IL-10 actually blocks some of those bad things. Okay. So what do we want to do? Because like I said, it's not just a matter of, knowing that all of this happens. We want to know, what are we going to do tomorrow? What are we going to do with that next patient who comes to us and tells us they're struggling? And remember, have an ill, take a pill. We don't want to just start with giving them some kind of medication. They come in a problem and give them something. Yes, we're going to be recommending, but that's not going to be our first thing. We want to have the lifestyle interventions and testing first, right? Because we want to know, we want to test, don't guess. Number one, if we can do nothing else for them, tell them how, or show them how to reduce their stress, whether it's mindfulness, whether it's meditation. A lot of people now are into the wearables and technology. Just putting on things that will let you know, hey, you're stressed. Take a breath, slow down. Teaching them just to breathe is so important, right? Sleep hygiene, okay? And one of the things I love to tell people is, your bedroom is for two things, okay? And two things only. And so we want to make sure that TVs, if they have a TV, if they're coming to you and they're telling you that they're exhausted and they're tired, and I ask now, is there a TV in your bedroom? And if there is, I recommend take it out. Take it out and see how you sleep. And so many will come back to you in a month or so and go, wow, I didn't realize that it could be so simple. Telling them about blue light, about that room temperature, keeping it cool, about having a small protein snack. This is so important, especially for women who are perimenopausal going into menopause. Having that small protein snack will help them to sleep throughout the night, right? Nutrition, avoiding that sad, the standard American diet, and increasing fruits, vegetables, and whole foods, not the store, the actual whole foods that they recognize what it looks like. And again, it is so simple, but you get these simple things that they add, to their lives. And within a week or two, they start seeing differences. Right, right. Yeah, Catherine says, yeah, so important, so important. Inflammatory markers. So that testing, looking at their markers for inflammation, what does their C-reactive protein look like? What is their homocysteine? Looking at things like iron and ferritin, which we don't often, that may not be the first thing we think of when we think of inflammation, but with chronic infections, iron levels tend to decrease as well as ferritin levels. Okay, so just knowing what things we need to look at to test, right? And then getting a metabolic evaluation and a continuous glucose monitor. I just wanted to have one a couple of weeks ago to see what it was like. And it was eye-opening. I recommend if you haven't done one, do it. Just 2 weeks, and then just look to see what foods you're eating and the response on your blood sugar. I found some things that I thought were completely, well, they are healthy in general, but for me, they spiked my blood sugar. And when my blood sugar spiked up, guess what happens afterwards? Spikes down. Okay, so it was really eye-opening for me. And so I often recommend this to a lot of patients, especially if they've been struggling with that, that pre-diabetic state. Getting a fasting insulin, because that's going to be elevating long before their blood glucose does, right? Because how many docs come in and you look at their blood sugar over the last 3 to 5 years, and it's been slowly creeping up, right? Creeping up, creeping up, creeping up. But nothing happens until it makes that magic number to 100. It was 99 the last test, but nothing happens until it's 100. Okay, so looking at these numbers, knowing what's going on, looking at their cortisol levels, their A1C, their thyroid function, and a full thyroid function, not just their TSH. Then how do we support the microbiome? And Kara's going to be going into real details about this, but I really want to start teaching you, telling you about it. The Total Gut Restoration Program through Microbiome Labs has been amazing for my clients. People who have been struggling for years with gut issues, and a lot that don't even realize that what they're struggling with are related to their gut, just start to heal with this 3-month restoration. You also want to, what we've been adding for specifically for the metabolic issues, because we know that a lot of it is stress, is ZenBio Dual, sorry, not Duo, Dual. And then finally, magnesium, vitamin D, and omega-3s if they're low. So as I mentioned, Kara's going to be going into that significantly. And ZenBiome Dual is right here. She'll be talking about that as well. Okay. Last thing that I wanted to really talk about is the anti-inflammatory activity of the specific, probiotic strain that's in there. And what we're seeing here is the NF-kappa B activity. Lots of inflammation if it's not, no inflammation if they're using it. Looking at a collagen model for arthritis. Again, just looking at those numbers with and without. Looking at other issues of inflammation, psoriasis. All of these are, significant, statistically significant. Chronic fatigue, ulcerative colitis, all of these things are decreased along with the specific strain. And why is that? Because the Bifidobacterium longum 1714 actually increases the anti-inflammatory cytokine IL-10. Remember, not all the interleukins are bad. IL-10 is actually anti-inflammatory. And so it's going to block that signaling that causes all the trouble, right? You don't have it. And so we don't have all the anxiety, the neuroinflammation. Love it, love it, love it. So how does this actually work? How do these two get through? How do they get through? They've got something that's called EPS, not LPS, EPS. It's kind of like an invisibility cloak that it puts on, and it can sneak through and get through into those dendritic cells to actually start making the IL-10. And that's how it actually works. So I just wanted to share with you before my time a case study to show you what it's like. So a woman who came to me, 57, a lot of issues, had already gone through menopause, but now she was struggling with a lot of stress. Life was life, okay? But seeing a lot of bloating, a lot of alternating diarrhea and constipation. I'm seeing that more and more frequently. They're not constipated, they're not diarrhea, they just kind of go back and forth. And as soon as I hear that, I'm automatically, as we all would be, thinking gut, right? Not sleeping well, pre-diabetic, okay, because now she's over that 100 mark, right, the fasting blood sugar, and her A1C is now 5.7, which isn't horrible, but is in that pre-diabetic range now. She was also right on the cusp, because of all of these other things, right on the cusp of being considered morbidly obese. And that, more than anything else, it wasn't the blood sugar, it wasn't all of the GI stuff, it was her doc telling her that she was about to be considered morbidly obese that told her, she said, okay, I've got to make a change. She went on the GLP-1s to start, couldn't tolerate it. They just made her so nauseated. She couldn't take it. And so came to us, and we actually went through that whole gut restoration we just talked about, the 3 months with the, the 3 products, and then as well as the ZenBiome Dual. What did we see? Gut health improved immediately. Okay, rebalancing of the gut and everything, reduction in gut inflammation, bloating, the GI issues. She started sleeping better. And we just saw the studies. If you're sleeping better, your gut's going to be doing better. You will do better as well. She lost 15 pounds without trying. Okay, she was not dieting, because now she felt better. She was less stressed, and she was sleeping, and she was able to tolerate it. So she was seeing all of the responses just by healing her microbiome. And so this is my point. If you can start with healing them, healing their lifestyle, giving them the support that their body needs to heal itself first, maybe they don't need some of these medications that we're hearing they need to be on for the rest of their life, right? Okay. All right. And then let's recap as well. So what we're going to be going into is, what we were talking about is the microbiome, stress, and metabolic health. We want to use an integrative approach, right? Looking at their stress, looking at their microbiome, looking at their hormones. And I did see someone there as well. Was she hormonally optimized? Yes, I didn't put that in there. I always check hormones in women of that age group. Okay, always do. And so yes. But it takes a little bit longer for that. And what we started with was starting to heal her gut, because a lot of times, unless you're giving them BHRT, you may not see the responses that you want as quickly as you want if they're still struggling with their gut. So I almost always start with healing their gut. Okay. Knowing that in that connection between the gut-brain axis and how important it is, looking at the GLP-1s and the GIP receptor agonists, using them when it's appropriate, knowing which ones are appropriate, and knowing that maybe we may not even need them if we give our bodies the support that they actually need. And then finally, that targeted supplementation that we talked about, the supplements, the microbiome support, and then just going from there. Okay. And so we're going to leave Q&A for later, but we're going to be switching over. And I think that's all I have, but I wanted to thank you. People are going to, you can put things in the chat. I'm going to look through as Kara's speaking, but that's my contact information, and we're going to go from there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lovelle.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks.
So we are going to be moving along. So we are going to save the Q&A for the end. We have another presentation for you. It's going to be about 30 minutes. And Kara Siedman is a registered dietitian, and she's going to be going through a little bit more of the nitty gritty of product application with regards to this topic. How do we repair metabolic issues leveraging the gut microbiome? And we're going to be talking about Microbiome Labs products specifically, how and when to use them, their mechanisms of action. And then when she wraps up, we're going to move on to live Q&A. So again, please keep dropping your questions in the Q&A box. And again, feel free to use the chat just to chat and add your thoughts and ideas and to answer any questions that Kara has for you. All right, so I'm going to give Kara a brief little introduction here. Kara Siedman is a registered dietitian. She has over 10 years of experience working in direct patient care within various demographics. Prior to joining Microbiome Labs, Kara started a successful integrative nutrition program with a large gastroenterology practice, working alongside physicians and advanced practice providers. She currently lives in Colorado with her husband, her baby daughter, and a spunky dog named Arlo. In her spare time, Kara enjoys hiking and spending time in the mountains, dancing to live music, yoga, or cooking a meal for family and friends. All right, Kara, the floor is yours.
Wow, that was quite the intro. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lovelle. That was really great. And I think, hopefully everyone walked away with some clinical pearls, but we're going to continue our focus in how we can work on our microbiome health to not only improve conditions like obesity and diabetes and metabolic conditions, but even improve those consequences. So obviously the focus being weight loss, we know this is a key intervention that improves these metabolic disorders. And as so many of us are familiar with, we know weight loss is difficult. We know it becomes frustrating between genetics and dietary choices, physical activity, all of these lay the groundwork, but we know this puzzle is so much more complex, and hence the rise in the use of these weight loss and diabetes medications that are now being used for weight loss. So the gut microbiome really adds this new layer to the story, and one that we don't often consider being a key player in either a driver of these conditions or possibly and potentially making it harder to even have success with these interventions like weight loss. So this is really an exciting area for us to work on and really to manipulate and modulate. Okay, so Dr. Lovelle went through this in beautiful depth, so I won't spend too much time, but it is very important. There's a reason for repetition. It's so important for us to really understand those key characteristics of what is necessary to have a healthy, resilient, and well-functioning microbiome. And we know that that includes having good diversity and a low level of pathogens, strong mucosal barrier. And when there's dysbiosis, right, when there's an imbalance in that microbial ecosystem, and that's where we start to see changes to the gut, right? We see low keystone strains like Akkermansia, which we talked about, and we'll talk a little bit more. We know Akkermansia is really important when it comes to not just the health of the mucosal barrier, but plays a huge role in blood sugar management and weight. But it's not a good thing when we have a low diversity of these guys, because that can impact our ability to produce robust short chain fatty acid production. And all of this, like Dr. Lovelle mentioned, leads to a disrupted mucosa. And essentially, when we have a dysfunctional gut barrier, then too much LPS and other bacterial toxins can get into the immune system and start to trigger inflammation and immune activation. So the focus on our story is LPS and this specific bacterial compound, but really what happens when they're able to cross that intestinal barrier and get to the immune system. So most of us here already know, and we heard Dr. Lovelle discuss LPS a little bit. If you've come to any Microbiome Labs webinar, I think we always mention LPS, but this is a bacterial endotoxin. So these are large molecules. LPSs are large molecules that are found on the outer membrane of our gram-negative bacteria. And we have a lot of gram-negative bacteria, but our proteobacteria has the highest number of LPS-containing species. It contains the most pathogenic species. And there's a particular portion on the LPS molecule, this, let me see if I can, okay, this lipid A portion, which is the innermost portion. And this is really what's responsible for the toxicity. And this is essentially what creates that toxic activity. And it's this portion, when able to get into circulation, is what drives that immune activation. But LPS will circulate at low levels in healthy individuals. It's when we have a dysfunctional gut, it's when we have a breakdown in that mucosal barrier that it becomes extremely inflammatory and immunogenic. Dr. Lovelle did go through this. So again, what happens? What is this immune activation that's taking place? So after eating, we naturally get a rise in LPS within that first 5 hours of that postprandial period. So in this, story of LPS breaching from that lumen, from that innermost part where the microbiome is and getting into circulation, what can happen is first we have this breach, right? We have this breach into the intestine through the intestinal barrier, an intestinal barrier that's disrupted, and LPS is essentially getting out. So then LPS will bind to that LBP. It's a protein. We think of this as the shuttle or the taxi driver, the Uber driver. And this is what will shuttle LPS to our immune cells, like our macrophages, our dendritic cells. And so once it's bound to those immune cells, that's where we trigger these immune complexes, these CD14, TLR4 complexes. And these are found on all of our immune cells throughout the whole body. And this is what will lead to that activation of NF-kappa B. NF-kappa B is that master switch. So if NF-kappa B gets turned on, it is what starts to promote the production of our pro-inflammatory cytokines. So I always use the analogy of like, if I walk into my house and I press a light switch that turns on every light of the house, I don't necessarily want that to happen. So we don't necessarily want NF-kappa B being triggered, because then we get the production of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. And if this is happening enough, then this is essentially what leads to low-grade chronic inflammation. And this low-grade chronic inflammation doesn't just exist in the gut, but beyond. And we heard Dr. Lovelle discuss the impact on the brain, but it extends to our metabolic system, our liver, our heart, and beyond. And so what we eat, and specifically the type of fat that we eat, matters and has a greater impact on LPS. And so what happens when we eat, especially when we eat fat? So fat will we create these lipid rafts within the body that go across our cell membranes, and that's necessary to bring fat into digestion to be processed and digested. And so since our LPS molecules are fatty-like molecules, that lipid A portion resembles saturated fat. As our body's pulling in these fats to be digested, it looks at LPS and says, hey, you look familiar. And so it starts to pull in LPS into circulation. And what some of the research has found, and there have been a lot of research, not just in animal models, but in human models, to show that certain types of fat have a greater endotoxemic response. And in fact, your saturated fats, and specifically your coconut oil, has the greatest impact or the greatest endotoxemic response, whereas your omega-3 fatty acids actually have a reduced endotoxemic response. And this is all occurring within that 2 to 5 hours following a meal. So the type of fat we eat matters. And we know that oftentimes, right, with obesity, with diabetes, with metabolic conditions, there tends to be a higher intake of saturated fat. And we know the standard American diet is a risk factor for obesity, metabolic syndrome. So as Dr. Lovelle discussed, right, this is a major driver of obesity, but the type of fat could actually be worsening this. So saturated fat omega-3s actually have opposite effects on LPS, and LPS being brought into circulation. And that endotoxin toxicity is actually reduced when we substitute omega-3 fatty acids for saturated fat. So our goal is to actually keep LPS in the gut where it belongs. Otherwise, we drive a condition known as metabolic endotoxemia. And all that metabolic endotoxemia is this innate immune response due to LPS that essentially leads to low-grade chronic inflammation. It's estimated to affect anywhere from 33% of the Western population, but I actually argue that that's more. And Dr. Lovelle went into the demographics and the rise of obesity and diabetes. And so I would actually argue that this is happening much, much more often. But metabolic endotoxemia is characterized by having higher LPS concentrations during that first 5 hours of eating after consumption of a meal. And what the studies have shown is that meals high in fat, meals denser in calories seem to impact this condition more. So metabolic endotoxemia is characterized by having increased amounts or increases in those pro-inflammatory cytokines, interleukin-6, interleukin-1 alpha, interferon gamma, triglycerides, and even postprandial insulin. And they've found that circulating endotoxin levels actually increase with BMI. So the more obese we are, the greater endotoxemia we're seeing. So what does this low-grade chronic inflammation look like from a microbiome perspective? So some of you may be familiar with our Biome Effects test. This is our functional microbiome analysis. This is a test that not only looks at who is in the microbiome, but it also looks at what are our microbes doing. And so we can see here that there's different microbial signatures that can take place that start to show signs of dysbiosis and can then essentially lead to further inflammation and mucosal degradation. So we're going to see changes in diversity. We're going to see elevated or changes in those dysbiosis ratios, lots of pathogens, certain families that are more prone to increasing inflammation like Enterobacteriaceae. Again, those low keystone species, especially Akkermansia. We're going to see more proteolytic fermentation, so the functions that are producing byproducts that can be more harmful. And so this all leads to mucosal degradation, intestinal barrier permeability, and systemic immune response. So specifically, how does this translocation of LPS into circulation and the inflammation that ensues drive these metabolic conditions and cause symptoms like obesity and diabetes, or conditions like diabetes? This is just one study. This was a study that looked at the impact of metabolic endotoxemia on obesity and our adipocytes. And this was looking at basically showing that LPS damaged our adipocyte function, and it prevented the browning process. And we know that brown adipose tissue is tissue that's more dense in mitochondria. This is a tissue that, or adipose tissue that, because it's rich in mitochondria, that's what gives it its brown color, that you're going to actually have more energy expenditure, or you're going to use that energy and that fat more versus using it or versus storing fat. And so they found that metabolic endotoxemia actually contributed to more obesity-related metabolic dysfunction through changing our adipocyte function. So it begs the question, what comes first? We know there's a link between obesity and other metabolic conditions like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and diabetes. But what comes first? Does obesity and diabetes drive endotoxemia, or is it potentially the other way around? So I love showing this article because, for one, it was put out by the American Diabetes Association, and this article dates back all the way to 2007, which is really at the start of the Human Microbiome Project, like really when things just started kicking off in research. So this is a 2007 study that basically showed that metabolic endotoxemia did come first, and that LPS was identified as a triggering factor for obesity and insulin resistance. So what are we going to see? What types of things are we going to see when it comes to obesity within the microbiome? Diversity is a big one. This really begins to set the stage for a dysfunctional gut, where you cannot have a healthy or resilient microbiome if you have low diversity. We're going to see changes in Firmicutes and Bacteroidetes ratio. So higher Firmicutes Bacteroidetes ratio has been linked to higher BMI, more gut-liver dysfunction, inflammation. But we're also going to see high proteobacteria. That's your LPS containing groups, right? So much more LPS. But we're going to see lots of low keystone species, especially your butyrate producers. Faecalibacterium's low Akkermansia, which we know plays a huge role in pathophysiology of obesity and diabetes as well. But you're also going to see low Prevotella. There's been newer studies that have come out now looking at Prevotella abundances and how this was inversely correlated with body weight change. So they basically did a study looking at people who were obese lost more body weight when consuming a high fiber resistant starch diet when they had Prevotella versus those that didn't on the same diet. They didn't lose as much. So it may be actually useful in understanding obesity and the management of obesity. Eukaryota, which correlates to methane production. So methanogens, which is part of our eukaryota, these can contribute to weight gain because they slow intestinal transit. They impair our gut motility. So they can therefore increase the caloric uptake from foods in the digestive tract, which we know can exaggerate weight gain, but it also exaggerates digestive issues like constipation. Diabetes, we're going to see, similar shifts, but we're going to see big shifts in the production of our short chain fatty acid producers, especially butyrate, since butyrate plays a very key role in the pathophysiology of diabetes and obesity. But we're going to see low keystone species. We're going to see low diversity as well. So getting eyes on the microbiome is helpful because it can really paint the picture of how not only can we see who is in the microbiome functioning, but also see how some of these changes in the microbiome are potentially laying the path for issues that can occur down the road. So we know endotoxemia is a thing. We know this is something that's happening. And so how can we manage this? Obviously, aside from improving our diet, reducing saturated fat, we know this is something that obviously worsens metabolic endotoxemia. But really this exciting area of modulating the gut microbiome being truly a newer tool, especially when it comes to working with these patients with metabolic issues, but really a great tool to improve this chronic low-grade inflammation that's stemming from a dysfunctional gut that's essentially leading to these metabolic dysfunctions and complications. So how can we rebalance our microbes to increase microbial diversity, right? We know that you cannot have a healthy microbiome if you have low diversity. And we know that people with obesity, diabetes, metabolic conditions have low diversity. So many of you are familiar with this. This is our landmark study. And so we know that one way to improve diversity and rebalance our species to increase beneficial species is really to decrease those species that can cause harm or wreak havoc. And so this study looked at megaspores' ability to reduce LPS, which we know is associated with more harmful bacteria. And so essentially what they did in this study was there was a placebo and then a probiotic group, which was given megaspore. And there were 75 healthy men and women college students, and they were provided a meal. This was a thin, cheese pizza meal. So again, higher in that saturated fat. And essentially what they found was after 30 days of supplementation without any other changes, there was a 42% reduction in serum endotoxin levels. And in the placebo group, there was actually a 36% increase. And again, no other changes with the exception of just consuming cheese pizza. So there was over 70% difference between the groups. So megaspore was really starting to come in and start to heal those intestinal junctions and really preventing those LPSs from getting into circulation. They also measured ghrelin, which we know is our hunger hormone. This stimulates appetite and fat storage. And they found reduced ghrelin levels postprandial or post-supplement, post-probiotic. But the other thing they found was with the probiotic group that there was a reduction in postprandial insulin. So after eating, insulin trended down. So there was more insulin sensitivity to that meal. And they also found improvement in interferon gamma, which is a common pro-inflammatory cytokine that's elevated in metabolic endotoxemia, as well as diabetes and obesity. And what I find very fascinating is that it can often take up to 16 weeks to reduce body weight enough that you actually see these inflammatory markers change. So to me, it's like really exciting and very, very interesting that we can see these same biomarker changes in literally a quarter of the time, but also in the absence of weight loss. So it just highlights the profound ability of microbiome modulation and working on the microbiome and improving our health and metabolic health and beyond the gut. They also looked at triglyceride levels, and they found overall 24% reduction in triglycerides. So we know that the number one benefit of a true probiotic is the ability to modulate the microbiome, to mitigate leaky gut, to improve the intestinal barrier, protecting the host. And this is what we're seeing, in this study with megaspore. And so obviously the only way that LPS can truly get into circulation is through a leaky gut or through having that hyperintestinal permeability. So if we see a decrease in those LPSs, then we know there's some healing within the intestinal barrier and an improvement in that mucus barrier to prevent those LPSs from getting into circulation. This was another study we did with megaspore, and we saw that overall there was an increase in microbial diversity. And really one of the most unique aspects of megaspore is the ability to come in and improve that microbial landscape. But we also saw an increase in Akkermansia and bifidobacterium. So we like to think of megaspore as that probiotic that promotes probiotics. We saw changes in some of the functions. We saw less ammonia production, which we know is a byproduct of dysbiotic bacteria. We also want to make sure we talk about increasing the short chain fatty acids. So metabolic disorders, obesity, diabetes, we know that these are associated with being in a state of low-grade chronic inflammation, and short chain fatty acids play a huge role. So just a question for everyone. Does anyone know what the average fiber intake per day is among Americans? You get some choices here. 15, 12, A. We have a lot of A's. Some of you got it. It's 10 to 15 grams. So our goal really when it comes to dietary fiber is anywhere from 25 to 35 grams, but really 40 grams and above is what's noted to achieve, blood sugar regulating benefits. So we can really see that we're well below that mark. And this impacts the amount of short chain fatty acids because we don't have that substrate then that's available for our microbes to break down. Or if you have more pathogenic species there, you're not going to yield more short chain fatty acids. So as we discussed earlier, and I mentioned, a dysfunctional gut is one that has lower, less robust short chain fatty acid production. So short chain fatty acids have a ton of benefits. Within the gut, they decrease inflammation. They're important to decrease intestinal permeability. But beyond the gut, and Dr. Lovelle covered this, in more depth and looking at all the different tissues that are involved with these incretins. But one of the most important aspects of short chain fatty acids is their ability to bind to these G protein coupled receptors, which are expressed all throughout the body. And they're expressed in all of these important tissues that we know play a huge role in metabolic conditions and our hunger and our appetite. But it's the activation of these receptors that results in the production and the secretion of our incretins. So GLP-1, peptide YY, right? GIP, serotonin. But they also, short chain fatty acids also stimulate the secretion of insulin and ghrelin and leptin. So they indirectly impact gastric emptying, since we know that these hormones and peptides slow gastric emptying. They influence intestinal transit, but they also have a positive effect. Our short chain fatty acids have a positive effect on appetite and food intake through the gut-brain axis. And that's what Dr. Lovelle spent a lot of time talking about. So we know that through the gut-brain axis, that the brain plays, such an important regulatory role when it comes to energy homeostasis, right? We think of the brain as that master conductor of food intake behavior, as well as the master thermostat for energy expenditure. So beyond the gut-brain axis, we have this gut metabolic brain axis. And this is where those incretins and serotonin play a huge role in our eating behaviors, as well as insulin regulation. And the vagus nerve is a big part of that, being that superhighway that transmits these signals. And I don't want to spend too much time, but I do think it's interesting because we now have studies that show obesity is actually being characterized by having a dysregulation in vagus nerve signaling. We're seeing that people who suffer from obesity are actually at an increased risk of developing neurocognitive and neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's. So it points to this greater neural inflammation that we're seeing as part of this population. And a lot of this is due to not having that short chain fatty acid production, because short chain fatty acids can cross that blood-brain barrier, and especially butyrate, which we know then can start to counteract some of those obesity-related neurological changes. So if you have low production of short chain fatty acids in the gut, then less is available to travel to the brain. And then we have less hormone and peptide production like GLP-1 and GIP, less serotonin, we get less secretion of these. And so if we can improve our short chain fatty acid production in the gut, then we can improve the production and secretion of these hormones and peptides that essentially signal receptors in the brain that result in increased satiety, decreased hunger, a reduced drive to eat, and essentially an overall reduction in inflammation in the brain. So this was a study we did, a 4-week study that combined Megaspore with Megapre. And essentially what was found is post-supplementation, we saw that increase in those keystone species that are not just playing a huge role in the overall health of the microbiome, but also these are major short chain fatty acid producers. They changed the microbial landscape so that pathogens and more of that LPS containing bacteria, it's a less friendly home for them. But we also saw an 80 to 140% increase in short chain fatty acid production without any other changes. We did another study that looked at the combination of Megaspore with Megapre on mRNA expression and changes in body fat. So essentially the study set out to determine if 90 days of prebiotic and probiotic supplementation could alter mRNA, and mRNA that are specifically responsible for inflammation and chronic disease risk. But they also wanted to see if there were any changes in the relative distribution of fat. And so there was really this question that the researchers set out was, can we shift an individual's metabolic health independent of weight loss, which is pretty profound. And Dr. Lovelle mentioned that visceral adiposity, yes, everyone wants to see a lower number on the scale, but it's really that visceral adipose tissue that is connected to having more inflammation. We know this is a more hormonally active tissue that drives inflammation, is really responsible for that low-grade chronic inflammation. So essentially what was found is after supplementation, there was an overall 35% reduction in visceral adiposity. And so this was in the absence of weight loss. So some of you may be wondering, well, how is that possible? Well, visceral adipose tissue is really only 10% of all the fat that's stored in the body. So since it only makes up about 1/10 of our total body fat, you really can have a significant reduction in that visceral adipose tissue, but not see a change in your weight. But we know this is having a greater impact on inflammation. And then also what they found was changes in mRNA. And so just a really quick, going back to our biochemistry and biology, right? mRNA, this is your messenger RNA. they carry genetic information that's needed to make proteins. And so each mRNA specifically encodes the information for proteins that are involved in every different bodily function. So you have very specific mRNA. And what they found was post supplementation that there were a total of 15 mRNA that were differentially expressed. And these mRNA were associated with greater inflammation. So this is a good thing that we saw a differential expression in mRNA that are very much correlated with progression of inflammatory diseases, systemic inflammation, adipose tissue inflammation. Whoops. And so we saw not only was there that change in adipose tissue inflammation and systemic inflammation related to that mRNA, but that 35% reduction in visceral adipose tissue really showed that this ability to modulate the microbiome, how this can shift us to a more metabolically healthier state by working on our foundation, by really working on the microbiome. And this is probably because of, two reasons: that we improved intestinal permeability, there was a reduction in LPS, right? So less inflammation, a less load on our pancreas. And then that increased short chain fatty acid production to help with, the metabolic aspect, the increased production and secretion of these neuropeptides. And so again, it supported that shift to a metabolically healthier state. Okay, so how can we improve that intestinal mucus layer, that epithelium integrity? But at the same time, we still want to work on reducing LPS production and translocation as we're working on healing and sealing the microbiome. I love this image. So just to review, right? So we have our lumen, that innermost part of the intestines. This is where your microbiome resides, right? All these sprinkles you see is our bacteria, our Firmicutes and Bacteroidetes. And then we have this mucus layer, this muc2 layer, and it's 2 layers thick. This is, the only sterile part of the body, really. We know that pretty much everywhere else has bacteria. And it's important because it's there to protect the epithelium. That epithelium, which is that single cell layer right beneath that mucus layer, that is really that barrier, that mucus barrier, that mucus layer is really that barrier between what's happening in your microbiome, between what's happening in your immune system. And so if you have a breakdown in this mucus barrier, if you have an epithelium that has intestinal permeability, you have weak and tight junctions, then that's where we get this immune activation and inflammation. So this is a study that's looking at the benefits of serum bovine immunoglobulins, which we have in our mega IgG as well as mega mucosa. And this was a very similar study to our Megaspore study, where there was 19 subjects that were given a high-fat meal, actually pizza again, to look at the effects of reducing LPS and endotoxemia. And what they found was, regardless of the dose, that 45 days of using just immunoglobulins at various doses, so 1 gram, 2 gram, 4 grams, had a significant reduction in dietary endotoxemia, that endotoxemic response when eating. And this is because we know that serum bovine immunoglobulins bind and neutralize and remove a wide array of harmful bacteria and bacterial endotoxins like LPS. So this is important because it's another way of shuttling these harmful byproducts out of the body. There's even new data coming out with serum bovine immunoglobulins that they have some prebiotic benefits, that they can actually also increase that short chain fatty acid production, which again plays such a key role in not just the pathophysiology of these metabolic conditions, but obviously a key role in the health of the microbiome, but also in the production of these key hormones and neuropeptides that we're talking about. Our megamucosa also contains polyphenols, which also play a huge role in inhibiting the activation of NF-kappa B, so the prevention of turning on that master switch. Can also help with insulin resistance. We also know that citrus polyphenols are also really good at increasing butyrate production, which again is so important. So any help that we can get, because again, diet and genetics and all these other things are only going to take us far. So we're offering more support in working on our foundation. Whoopsies. Our megamucosa also contains 4 essential amino acids that have been shown to increase colonic mucin synthesis. So again, if you can repair that mucin layer, if you can strengthen the intestinal barrier, then you're essentially going to reduce LPS induced inflammation and the translocation of LPS. So how do we get to the root, right? How do we begin to heal the microbiome? Dr. P in the chat box stated, you have to fix the leaky roof. You don't just mop the floor. So I love that, right? So we're here to focus on fixing the leak and improving the foundation. And so this is where our total gut restoration comes into play. We know that metabolic endotoxemia, right, is a result of having this increased intestinal permeability, this loss of diversity, lots of LPS, and it's that innate immune response. So total gut restoration is our 90-day system that uses megaspore with megapre and megamucosa, what we just went through. But I also like to add in extra IgG at that time and starting it right away, especially because we know IgG helps to bind and neutralize so many different bacteria and bacteria toxins, but especially that LPS, and especially if you're noticing lots of proteobacteria or other signs of poor intestinal barrier, especially when doing things like biome effects, like low Akkermansia and low keystone species. Now, I didn't talk too much about it, but I want to spend a few minutes since I'm right on time. But MegaGuard is our upper digestive support. Oopsies, that just totally went away. There we go. So MegaGuard is our upper digestive support. This is a really wonderful supplement to help not only, with the improving symptoms and those unpleasant side effects, which we know is usually the #1 complaint when it comes to taking the GLP-1s or the GLP-1 agonists or the dual agonists. It contains gingerols, which is really good for nausea, really great for vomiting, but gingerols can inhibit gas production from archaea, from methanogens. And we know that people with obesity tend to have greater uricariota and greater methane production. Artichoke leaf extract, which is also in our MegaGuard, is great to support biliary flow, but it also helps to support gastric emptying. And then there's a flavonoid-rich DGL known as Gut-Guard that also supports gastric emptying. So a wonderful tool to help with alleviating and relieving symptoms related to those medications, especially while you're working on improving that foundation. And then finally, Dr. Lovelle mentioned, we want to support the gut-brain axis because it's beyond the gut-brain axis. It's the gut-brain metabolic axis that we have to pay attention to. And so ZenBiome Dual is our dual strain probiotic that supports the gut-brain. It contains 2 unique bifidobacteria strains, Bifidobacterium longum 1714 and Bifidobacterium longum 35624, that's targeting inflammation not just in the GI tract, but inflammation in the brain. And we know that obesity and a lot of these metabolic conditions are also co-occurring with disorders of gut-brain interaction, like IBS, as Dr. Lovelle went into detail. But we know that obesity also carries more neurologic consequences. So with that, thank you guys so much for joining us today. We have a special coupon just for you. So please take a snapshot of it. This is 10% off your cart and free shipping, but this is only valid for the next few days. So take advantage of it. And then we do have our webinar series. We offer 2 webinars a month. And we're starting our foundation series is about to kick off again. And this is really just taking us back to school. It's taking us back to really getting a better understanding of the microbiome, the digestive tract, what can go wrong. So the first series focuses on structure and function of the digestive tract. We have lots of clinical pearls. And then we also kicked off a biome effects series. We're going to be starting our second series with Dr. Sarah Ellis, where she's starting to get into some more of those clinical patterns, or what we talked about earlier in this session, those microbial signatures that we use to identify changes or dysfunctions along the gut-brain axis or the gut-skin axis, or like we talked about today, the gut metabolic axis. So hopefully you all can join in, and I just thank you for joining us. Hopefully you walked away with some clinical pearls. And now we have time for Q&A.
Yes. Thank you so much, Kara. That was amazing. Packed as usual with goodies. And I have put some of those details in the chat for everyone. The coupon code, it is good through June 7th. So please take a look at Microbiome Labs selections and see if you would like to take advantage of that special offer. And we also added the registration link for next Wednesday's webinar, which is again going to be taking you back to basics, back to school, old school, but it's definitely like not basic. You are going to be just flushed with information. You're going to love it, I swear. So we gave you the registration link there. And yeah, so I'm going to be handing the Q&A off to the professionals, the clinicians of the day. So Kara and Dr. Lovelle are going to come back to answer some questions, but joining us is another member of our Microbiome Labs clinical team. We have Sarah Ellis, naturopathic doctor. So Dr. Sarah is going to come on board and she's going to kind of guide this Q&A session, and she's going to be relaying your questions from today's class to the speakers, and hopefully that you guys will get all of your burning questions answered. And if you have anything else to add, I mean, of course, feel free to put it in the Q&A box in the chat. We'll get to as many questions as we can before we run out of time today at the top of the hour. So I'm just going to give you a quick intro to Dr. Sarah. Dr. Sarah is a naturopathic physician and a clinical science liaison here at Microbiome Labs. She spent the last 10 years investigating the safety and efficacy of natural products. As a naturopathic physician, she uses nutrition, nutraceutical supplementation, and lifestyle adjustments to help her patients get to the root cause of their health concerns. She specializes in women's health, gut health, nutrition, and family health. So I'm going to say bye-bye for now, and please welcome Dr. Sarah. She'll be leading you through the rest of today's Q&A.
Thanks so much, Angelica. Hi, everyone. I'm sure you all feel much like myself. We learned so much from Dr. Lovelle and from Kara, and you all have been asking some really wonderful questions. So let's jump right on in. The first question is a pretty fun one, and I actually would like to know the answer as well. So we have a question from, actually, I think you might have answered it already, Dr. Lovelle. She asked what ballerina company you were in. She was excited to see that you were a dancer. And I actually would love to know. So what dance company were you a part of?
So most of it was the Dance Theater Harlem in New York City, traveled around the world with them, but I also danced with the Atlanta Ballet, the Princeton Ballet, and a Gillespie.
That's amazing.
17 years altogether.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful.
Don't add up all the numbers though.
Well, that's fun. I'm glad we were able to learn a little bit more about you. So now let's get into some really good questions. I want to start with more questions around the drugs, like the GLP-1 agonist. And so we have a question from Anne. Is it the drug or the actual effect of losing weight along with losing toxins? I believe this question is in reference to, of course, the weight loss, but also some of the impact and benefits that come from the GLP-1 agonist.
Okay, so are you, I guess they're asking, are they losing weight because of the drug itself?
Correct, or the fact that they're losing some toxins throughout the process. Along
with it. Okay. Yes, well, if you remember that picture of all of the effects that it has, one of the big ones is that effect on lipolysis. And so that is that one big issue that's right there. As far as the releasing of toxins, if you think about it, if they have decreased gastric motility, they may actually have a little bit more toxin buildup, technically. And one of the questions that I saw later was, why would you take Megagard and a GLP-1? Well, guess what? A lot of the people struggle with that slow motility and constipation. Megagard is great to take. It's actually going to actually take away or reverse some of the side effects that they've been struggling with. Yeah, exactly.
I'm so glad you asked that question because, yeah, that's exactly it. Megagard really will help with those side effects. And then we also had another question about whether or not the GLP-1 agonist can inhibit pathogenic bacteria. Has there been any studies to show what impact that GLP-1 agonists have on the microbiome? And this will be for Kara and Dr. Lovelle.
I'm going to give that one to Kara.
Yeah. So actually, interestingly enough, they're starting to come out with some limited research, so some preliminary research to show the benefits that these medications are having. And so far, what we're seeing is that they are actually improving some of these, like what those patterns I put on the screen before, as far as obesity or microbial signatures that are very common in obesity. We're actually seeing some of those improvements with the GLP-1s. Now, what we don't know, is it the GLP-1s or is it really just the act of weight loss? Because we know there's improvement to the microbiome when you lose weight, but so far so good and so far very promising in terms of what we're seeing. Now, do the GLP-1s actually inhibit pathogenic bacteria? That I don't think we know, but if we're losing weight and we're doing things to help to support, the microbiome and improving the overall health, then yes, we are. And like I said, overall, we see improved diversity with weight loss. So again, I think it's very promising.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We also have a couple of questions. I would love for Dr. Lovelle, you can chime in as well, but I was thinking about Kara for this question. Can you walk through the microbiota's pathway with regard to tryptophan metabolism. So how does gut dysbiosis, I know you kind of talked about this already, and Dr. Lovelle shared that amazing schematic, but if you can kind of, briefly walk us through how the gut and gut dysbiosis impacts tryptophan metabolism.
Yeah, so tryptophan is metabolized actually through 3 different pathways, but interestingly enough, 95% of the ingested tryptophan, which we know it's an essential amino acid, it comes directly from the diet, is actually metabolized through that pathway that Dr. Lovelle mentioned, that's that kynurenine pathway. And so what's difficult, or what we want, we want tryptophan to be available to produce serotonin and melatonin. But the problem is because we are in a state of chronic inflammation, because we have all this LPS, because we have hypercortisolemia, we're stressed out, we've got this this metabolic endotoxemia that's putting us in this state of low-grade chronic inflammation, that this is driving tryptophan to produce this neurotoxic compound known as quinolinic acid. And it does this through the activation of an enzyme known as IDO. And that enzyme gets turned on when inflammation is present. So if we're producing this neurotoxic compound, well, now there's less serotonin that's available to make melatonin, or there's less tryptophan available to make melatonin and serotonin. So if we can support the reduction of inflammation, and that's where one of the benefits of that bifidolongum 1714 strain comes in, is it can actually block inflammation, which prevents the activation of IDO. We can now shuttle tryptophan down its neuroprotective pathway.
Exactly. Yeah, I like to kind of call it how inflammation and dysbiosis kind of block the exit ramp. So if you think of tryptophan as a car going down a freeway, it blocks tryptophan's ability to take the exit to make serotonin and melatonin. So beautiful explanation. Thank you. Dr. Lovelle, would you like to add anything?
I love that answer.
The chart shows it really well.
Yeah.
It does.
So the question that has been asked several times today, since you shared this tidbit, Kara, many want to know about saturated fats and coconut oil, now that we know that saturated fats play a huge role in like LPS translocation. The first question is coconut oil good or bad? And
this is my favorite.
Since saturated fat is like out, what kind of fat could they cook with?
I love this question, and Dr. Lovelle, I'm so, want to hear your answer. I think this is why diet has to be individualized. As a dietitian who's worked in various demographics, there's very few foods like that we can truly say, aside from maybe trans fat, that doesn't have any benefits. But the problem is if you have a dysfunctional gut, if you have a breakdown in your mucosal barrier, if you've got low diversity, if you've got all these things that are setting the stage for bacteria and bacterial toxins like LPS to get into systemic circulation, then no, coconut oil is not good until you start to heal up those intestinal junctions and prevent that translocation. And I think that, we see this increase in this greater endotoxemic response with coconut oil, and maybe it has to do with, the type of medium chain triglyceride that it gets pulled into the lymphatic and circulation a lot easier. So you're creating that, so you're pulling it in a lot better. But until you start to heal the gut, to me, I always promote more of our omega-3 fatty acids. I like to cook with walnut oil, or really my favorite is avocado oil, which has a neutral effect. Avocado oil is a high heat oil. So for those of us that maybe cook a little bit higher than we're supposed to, as my husband sometimes tells me, coconut oil to me is one of the best, but I like to make salad dressings with olive oil. I like to use walnut oil. I think it's fun to use different oils that you have available. But yeah, everyone asked that question. We were back in the day, it was like, you got a broken arm, like rub some coconut oil on it. But we have to be a little bit more mindful of there's really not a one size fits all model.
Absolutely. Dr. Lovelle?
Totally agree with that. And that's something I always tell people, that you cannot, even if something is good, we're talking about coconut, but even if something is good, if it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work. We have to be open and willing to let go of things that, the media and everyone else says, the gurus say is great. If for us individually, it does not work. I also am an avocado oil cooker. A user. I also use ghee, and I do use it's like fermented ghee. So it's not just the traditional type, but it's a little bit better. It doesn't have any milk solids in it. However, for me, if I use a lot of it, I can see my cholesterol starting to creep up. So, I use it more for flavor than for actual cooking.
Yeah.
And I love olive oil, but not so much.
not so much for cooking.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, kind of still on the dietary piece, what are your thoughts on the ketogenic diet as it pertains, of course, to weight loss, but also the gut microbiome?
I'll let you go. I'll let you go because I definitely have my opinions. I'll let you go. If we're on the same
what
page.
I just said. Okay. So for some people, it works marvelously. I've had other people that go on keto and gain weight. Why? Because they can't digest fat. They don't metabolize fat well. A lot of that has to do with their genetics. There are certain genes, in SNPs that will not allow you to, and the ketogenic diet is absolutely not the way to go. But it could be something as simple as, and I think someone had mentioned food sensitivities, and that's a whole nother thing we could be talking about. But if you're sensitive to dairy and you're on a ketogenic diet, what's going to happen? You're going to struggle. So it really depends on the individual. Yeah.
And again, it's just not a one size fits all model, right? I always say that, a keto diet, if first of all, someone coming to me when I see patients, they're not coming to me saying, I feel amazing, right? There's usually something going on or they're failing. Right. But we do now see the effects of keto on the microbiome. And so I always say, before we start some of these dietary interventions, before we start even sometimes starting microbiome modulation, it is good to do some testing. It is sometimes nice to get eyes on it, because if yes, you can yield short chain fatty acids from protein, but a lot of protein, a lot of fat, right, changes the microbial signature within. And so is that going to potentially work against us in our goal for weight loss? And that's what we're now understanding, is that the microbiome can actually increase success of these weight loss or diabetes medications, or even things like they've done studies in gastric bypass and modulation of the microbiome, improving outcomes with people who've done it. So I always say that, yes, I think it's a great diet. Can people do it long term? Or what is the long-term effect or the detrimental effect that it may be having on the microbiome, which then could be setting us back? So it just goes back to personalized and individualized medicine.
Exactly. Thank you for sharing. Okay, we have a couple of questions about the Total Gut Restoration Kit. So first question, is the Total Gut Restoration Kit okay for someone who's presenting with histamine intolerance? I'll lead this question to Kara, and then Dr. Lovelle, if you have experience using the Total Gut Restoration in practice, would love to hear your clinical pearls as well.
So histamine intolerance obviously is pretty, there's a lot going on in people who are dealing, but a huge part of histamine intolerance is that we have this immune activation. And if, 70% of our immune system is contained in the gut, then we know there's something going on in the microbiome. In Total Gut Restoration, we've actually seen really incredible benefits to histamine intolerance. The spores are actually been shown to help break down histamines, where we know other probiotics can actually exacerbate histamine. So, I'm always cautious with my histamine intolerant patients. They tend to have a lot more pathogens. They tend to have a lot more LPS. So I may actually start them off first. I call it priming. I may start them off on some HU58, which is just Bacillus subtilis, to try to, field or try to crowd out those pathogens. But I love using IgG. That's one of my game changers in clinical practice for histamine intolerance. And I think it has to do with the decrease in immune activation. So I'll increase dose of IgG, which obviously supports the binding and removal of harmful bacteria, but can actually help reduce symptoms related to histamine intolerance. So I may start them on HU58, then transition them through the Total Gut Restoration. And I've seen incredible results because so much of it is what's happening when you activate the immune system, and your immune system is going to get greater activation when you have a breakdown in your intestinal barrier.
Exactly. And I'm glad that you mentioned, addressing the root cause of identifying the histamine producers and crowding them out, rather than just focusing on the symptoms associated with histamine intolerance. Anything you'd like to add, Dr. Lovelle?
Not really. I don't deal specifically with histamine intolerance, but the main thing is if your gut's healthy, you're going to do a lot better with almost anything.
For sure.
I think you mentioned this in your presentation, Dr. Lovelle, but something that I always focus on too is your microbiome is your foundation. So no matter what type of patient you're working with, you have to pay attention to our foundation. So it's always a good place to start, because when we get these patients that have hormones that are out of place, histamines, and everything that's going on, which we all deal with, that's why they come to functional medicine. To me, a great place to start is the microbiome, because it's playing a huge role. It's part of that three-legged
stool. Exactly. Yep. Dr. Lovelle, we have a question for you.
Yes.
Do you use GLP-1 agonists? If you do, is there a reason you do not utilize the inhibitors? Is it preference or another reason? The presentation gave great info and thank you.
GLT?
I'm thinking it's a typo, GLP-1. But I was wondering if maybe I missed something.
Okay, so okay, read that again then.
Yes. Do you use GLP-1 agonists? If you do, is there a reason why you do not utilize GLP-1 inhibitors?
Okay, well, the GLP-1 receptor agonist, I guess what we're asking.
Yeah.
We're doing that for all of the good responses that they have on, on the various aspects of our blood sugar, of our fat metabolism, of our heart now that we're seeing. So that's what on satiety. So that's why they're being used. And I think I did see a question about, the early ones that we started in the 2000s. So those were the exenatides and things that we mentioned that you had to inject twice a day. And they still exist today. They're still being used today, but most of them have moved over to the ones that you only have to inject once a week. So you're using the agonist because you want those good effects. You wouldn't want to use a antagonist to block those responses.
Right.
If I'm understanding the question right.
They also just put in an update. So they actually meant SGLT2 antagonist.
Gotcha. Okay.
Figured it out.
Okay, very good. I don't use them in my practice. And the main reason is that my practice is not really based so much on diabetes. And, in that people come to me because they want to lose weight. They want their hormones straight, they want their gut health, and they want to lose weight. And so these are better in that respect. The SLP actually work with the kidney. So they're keeping the kidney from, it helps the kidney to extract more of the glucose that's in it. So it's not as important to my clients, my patients that I work with. However, to a diabetic, absolutely, that's very important. As protective things on the kidney and the heart, as a matter of fact.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing. All right. We have a couple questions left. What are some microbiome products that would be an initial step to assist in better microbiome diversity? So, Kara, I'll kick this off to you, and then Dr. Lovelle, if you can share some of your clinical pros on how you support microbiome diversity in your practice, we'd love to hear.
Sure.
So, even just what we talked about today, right? Our total gut restoration, we've done studies in Megaspore, we've done studies in Megaspore combined with Megapre, all of that having a profound, influence on improving overall diversity, which is what we're looking for, right? We know that this is different than how other traditional probiotics work, where they don't actually change the microbial landscape. But some of your sensitive patients, if you are doing any microbiome testing, patients that maybe have lots of pathogens or that you're concerned, because Megaspore, it's a mod, man, it comes in and it does its job. So sometimes I'll start people on Restore Flora or HU58 again, just to kind of give a little bit of an ease in. And that's a really nice way, especially if you have those very sensitive patients. And I always combine it with IgG so that we can mop up any of that dead and dying bacteria, because as bacteria die off, right, this is why when we take antibiotics, even we can feel worse before we feel better. As bacteria die off, they emit things that can create, symptoms and be uncomfortable. So that IgG is so helpful in preventing that. But, again, if someone who's relatively healthy, doesn't have a lot of symptoms, really isn't dealing with a lot of GI issues, maybe doesn't have a lot of, obvious pathogens, again, you can start right with Megaspore. I'd always add some IgG in and then start to transition through the total gut restoration. That's always a good place to start.
Perfect. What about you, Dr. Lovelle?
I'm actually going to tell you about me. So, and how I got into lifestyle health. When I was in the hospital that third time, then in the ICU that third time in the space of that year, when I came out, I was so weak. I couldn't do anything except change what I ate. And that's how I started. I found a functional medicine provider. Why? Because when I went to my traditional physician, they wanted to put me on high dose steroids, which I took for about a week. was so dizzy, I was bouncing into walls. That was not when I was still a plastic surgeon. So that was not a good thing. And that's when I decided I needed to find a better way to reach my health. Went to a functional medicine provider. They checked, found out I had leaky gut, and Megaspore Biotic was the probiotic they put me on. And in 2 weeks, things had flipped around. I had more energy. I had developed this full body rash. I no longer had the rash. I mean, it was amazing. So I love the product. I love the company. And that's me. And that's what I share with my clients. We're going to start with the gut. A lot of them are like, well, it's this work. We're going to start with the gut. We'll get that basis done. And then we move on from there.
Awesome. I love hearing personal stories about Megaspore. It's a wonderful product that has really changed many lives. And so I love hearing practitioners like yourself share their impact with, or how it has impacted them. All right. I think we'll go through one more question, and this is a common one, so I did want to make sure that we answered this. When you are taking the Total Gut Restoration Kit, when you're done with the 3 months, what should the practitioner and patient do? Is there a maintenance phase? What is kind of the next step? Dr. Lovelle, maybe you can talk about what you do in your practice, and then Kara, you can kind of wrap up with our usual plan for the maintenance phase.
Yeah. So I pretty much tell them before they even start that they will most likely be on some form of probiotic ongoing. Now, they don't have to take it every day or twice a day like they were during the restoration, but we back it down. And usually they kind of end up at about 2 to 3 times a week that they're taking it. And they just keep that on. And the reason they do is because a lot of, if they haven't fully bought into changing all their lifestyle and changing everything else, they may start to trickle right back down that road. And so this allows them to maintain all of the gains that they got from their total restoration. So that's usually what we do. As far as the ZenBiome Dual, people love it and they stay on that. They're like, don't take it away. So they really enjoy that as well. So that one is more of a as needed, but I really talk about the Megaspore Biotic and staying on that on a maintenance dose going ongoing.
That's wonderful. Great point, because we're exposed to so many dysbiosis risk factors all the time, so we can always use that protective piece for Megaspore. Kara?
I agree. We can't eliminate these microbiome disruptors from our lives completely. So if you do all this work to help to seal and fix those cracks in our foundation, we want to try to maintain that. So we typically recommend people doing Megaspore at the 2 capsules, Mega Pre at the full dose, which is 6 capsules or 1 scoop, but also Mega Mucosa 6 capsules or 1 scoop, but just a couple days a week. So like I have my patients and myself included. I do Saturday and Sunday are my gut days, where I take those. But that's just to ensure it. And again, if you think about our diet, right? Most Americans are eating 10 to 15 grams of fiber. A lot of us, I always say many of us, and I'm sure many of us here, we have a healthier diet, but I also say that we have this like healthy, unhealthy diet, because I don't get like as much resistant starch as I should. I don't get as much of these complex fibers because it's just so hard when you go to the store. Like, I can't buy hemp seeds, chia seeds, flax seeds. I can't buy all of it at one time, right? So I just think that it's a little bit of an insurance policy when we take these to ensure that we're maintaining the health of the microbiome.
Agreed. Such a good point about, even the healthiest eater, we're not perfect. So great to have products that help fill in those gaps. Yeah. Thank you all so much for your attention today. Huge thank you to Dr. Lovelle for sharing your insight and your wisdom and your clinical pearls with us. I'm sure I can speak for our guests that we've learned so much and look forward to learning from you again. Thank you so much, Kara, for highlighting our Microbiome Labs products. And for those of you who maybe missed the coupon code, it is, I believe Angelica will put it in the chat again, but in case you want to write it down, it is PS-MK-JUN for June 24. You get 10% off your cart plus free shipping. And I believe it'll be available until June 7th. So thank you so much for your attention. The replay and the slides will be sent out in a few days. And I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you.